Thank you for a really great panel discussion. And Kathleen, I don't know if there's any questions that are coming from the stream, but certainly we can entertain those. I was reminded, if you want to hashtag, tweet California CA wildfires or hashtag wildfire and health. So we'll entertain questions from the audience. Yes, sir.
Fantastic presentation. Thank you very much. I'm a doctor, so I'm going to ask a very naive question. Why can we not contemplate housing or rent stabilization policies in California after events like this? We have laws around hiking of prices in gas supplies, for instance. Why can't we do such similar things around housing?
Before you answer that question, you mind just identifying yourself so we can have it for the record?
Yes, David Eisenman, UCLA.
Any of you want to take that on? Yes.
I think my response to that isn't more like a why, more like we did have that, at least in our region. There was a year-long, I guess moratorium, is that the right word? Basically, it was a year-long stop that was in place that prevented homeowners who are renting their properties to up their rent. But it was only for the year following the disaster. After that, it's fair game. I think what we've seen across California is mentioning that, you know, the disasters exacerbate existing issues. Housing's already an existing issue for a lot of our folks. And again, thinking about like our farm worker families who make $12,000, $15,000 a year of that, it's a big issue. So I would like to see something more in place in terms of policy, but at least in the year after the fire, we did have some types of protections for renters, and I'll pass it this way.
I don't have a specific on that, but I would say one thing that popped up, and I'm seeing it happen because I live outside the footprint of the Camp Fire, is insurance renewals and issues with insurance renewals right now. Non-renewals is happening all across the area, and the rates are going up. You know, like mine just got renewed at about 3.5 times what the rate I was paying. And so I was just talking to a natural resource economist the other day, and he's like, why don't we just create our own insurance funds and start our own programs around this? Because if there's one natural disaster that we could actually do something about, it's fire. You know, we can set fires and do it at the right time to mitigate this and make it safe. We can't do that for tornadoes. We can't do it for hurricanes. You know, it's just an idea that's out there, right? But not an answer for that, but another thought that we need to be thinking about as well.
Very briefly, even if you have those laws in place, you have to have the political will locally to enforce them. And in some of the rural areas, it would be, you would find you'd be hard pressed to find local folks that were willing to do that. Sometimes in more conservative areas of California, it's not what they think their role is.
Yes, Kathleen.
There was a brief question from the web asking whether or not these presentations are being recorded. And so as a reminder, a couple of days or a week or so after this, the videos and the PowerPoints will be posted on our website in perpetuity.
Thank you. I have a question for Mr. Hankins. You mentioned with regards to the indigenous Native communities that there is daily cultural resource monitoring. And I know you mentioned it, but you didn't have a chance to elaborate on that. And I was quite curious in terms of what that really entails and how you think about that relative to the issues of resiliency and connection between our landscape and communities.
Right. Well, I can speak to, for instance, Machupta tribe of Chico Rancheria. They have, I think, 42 cultural resource monitors that are out in the area of Paradise, and every structure that's been lost, every property that's been damaged has to be cleaned up. They excavate down, remove the first 6 inches of the topsoil, which is all removed. And while that process is taking place, there are cultural resource monitors, so tribal people trained in archaeology going out and looking for human remains, looking for cultural artifacts and those sorts of things. So this is a tedious process. There's, as I said, 42 people, so it's a large investment for a small tribe to be able to spend that kind of time, you know. And I can say that on the cultural side of it, they've not been able to participate in certain activities that they would normally do. Say with CSU Chico in the spring, they normally do what's called a spring renewal. So they come out, they do a demonstration of culture. There's basket weaving, there's other, you know, dancing and things like that. This year they canceled it because they just didn't have the time, because the people who would normally come and do that were up doing monitoring. So those are just some of those types of things, and then the, you know, the wear and tear on young families that are, you know, the parents are out doing this kind of work and then coming home and dealing with that.
Thank you. There's a question over here, and please identify yourself. We'll get the mic over there because we're recording you.
I'm Valerie Mahanovich, and I work with voluntary organizations active in disaster and the long-term recovery groups. And I have a question about the Undocu Fund. Never heard of that, and want to really make sure that that's included in the long-term recovery response. Is it in your communities that you worked in with the Undocu Fund? Were they tied in? Did they access the long-term recovery group, or is that a whole separate system because of trust issues? And
So I'm probably sounding like a record. Again, we were not a disaster relief organization. So a lot of these acronyms that came up for us in the recovery time were new. So LTRG, VOAD, we're like, what? And so we really tried to insert ourselves into these spaces. But with what we found with our local VOAD, they did amazing work. I don't want to discredit any of that, and VOAD does amazing work. It was just incompatible for us, and a lot of that had to do with the data sharing. So part of being part of the VOAD was you had to sign into this online portal for data management, for case management.
system? Yeah, I would.
Yeah, and so that, again, was being monitored by the Department of Homeland Security, and so it was a hard sell for us to tell our community members, you know, give us your information, we promise nothing's going to happen to it. So we did participate in those meetings, we did do report backs on the work that we were doing, but we were just separate from that. I think what was helpful with the VOAD was just reinforcing those relationships that we had, again, with our local Red Cross and United Way, so that when the time came for them to redistribute the extra funds they had, that relationship was in place. But yeah, so for our Undocu Fund, it was separately fundraised. It was us going to our different foundations across the state, getting that type of money, private donors, then also raising the admin piece, because we required a team of a coordinator, 6 promotora or outreach workers who also acted as interpreters. We had about 300 hours of Mixteco language that was provided throughout the Undocu Fund. So that's just a little bit more about the Undocu Fund that at least we ran, that we modeled again after Sonoma County. Do you want to add?
Oscar, yeah, you might.
Yeah, just want to say again that this was the Undocu Fund in Sonoma County received contributions from private philanthropy to set up. And they do work with an organization or a group called Rebuilding Our Community, The Rock. And this is the sort of the coordinating body that assesses the need of the individuals, and then they provide referrals to the Undocu Fund. But that is still an existing fund. It is staffed. And just with the recent flood evacuations, they were able to help people impacted by the floods in our lower Russian River. So I think it's a wonderful idea, and it fills a much needed gap in the recovery process, and it addresses the issue of safety and security for our vulnerable populations.
Thank you. We'll be in touch. I want to make sure you get included in with the, because we don't they don't discriminate, or, you know, it's all inclusive.
So I'm going to take a prerogative of, I think it's great the way that our panel was composed. Congratulations, Karen, for putting it together. But we have members from 2 community-based organizations and members from the county infrastructure and government. So I was wondering, between the time we have between now and starting lunch, what would you tell each other in terms of what is important in terms of looking forward, in terms of how we think about protecting vulnerable populations? How would you incorporate, and how would you ask your colleagues here at this table of representing respectively government and respectively community-based organizations? Go ahead, Oscar.
Oh, well, I think this experience was provided a lot of opportunity to rethink how we work better together. The fact is that in government, we tend to be very siloed. And it provided an opportunity to really work across silos, across sectors, to really understand the needs of the community. And for example, we now have a public information officer at the county that's bilingual. We now have contracts in place that can be quickly deployed to help serve vulnerable populations. All of our staff have received training on shelter management. We are now focusing on doing, trauma 101 or mental health 101, but working across all of our community. So the fire provided an opportunity for us to work together across sectors and to bring in, more importantly, the very people who are most impacted by these challenges. So I see a lot more opportunity, not only in working across sectors, not just within government, but with business, with philanthropy, with different community-based organizations, and the very people who are dealing with these issues on a daily basis, and think about sort of co-constructing meaningful solutions that will build resiliency over time.
I think the relationship building is key. I think what we had to our advantage as my COP was that we already had established relationships with our county supervisors, for example. We had established relationships with our county public health office, so that when we saw these gaps, it took a little bit because, the county was dealing with the natural disaster, but they were able to be responsive to us. And also in our county now, we do have a bilingual PIO, which was great to see deployed in the Woolsey Hill fire. So we didn't have that language access gap in that following fire in 2018. But those relationships, instead of just me as a random CBO cold calling someone, knowing that I have a direct line to someone and calling them and saying, hey, this is what's going on the ground. Let's work together and figure out what we need. But yeah, I think there's definitely more room for collaboration. I think that's part of why we're really excited about SB 160, to include that cultural competency piece in disaster relief planning. And to continue just to be present at these different tables that I mentioned. Again, the VOADs, for example, long-term recovery folks, and just letting people know that we are a resource and we're here to work with others.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's really important on the Indigenous side is, and I kind of jumped over the slide in my presentation because I was running out of time, went overtime. But there's trust responsibilities that agencies have to tribes, and in the state of California, they follow what the federal rules are for trust responsibility. And a lot of times agencies don't quite understand what that means, but tribes really, through self-determination, have the ability to set forth ways of doing things on their ancestral areas. And it's not just reservation boundaries or rancherias in California, it's the ancestral territories where that applies to. So I think it's really important to have those conversations if you're in an agency or an entity that has the ability to have those conversations with the tribes and engage them. Every tribe's going to have a different perspective on, be it fire or whatever that, thing that has to be dealt with in that community. But I think if we think about what empowerment through self-determination is, it allows for that common ground to be met and fulfilling what is right for that landscape. And I think about, in the case of some of the fires that happened outside of the Camp Fire, with this last year, we had a fire up on one of the mountains in the Sutter Buttes, which happens to be significant to every tribe in the Sacramento Valley. And as that fire was going, I was able to contact Incident Command, through back channels and say, hey, be careful where you're laying dozer blades, and let's think about this, as most as possible. But I think the quicker we can have those kind of conversations, get on the same page earlier, is really important. So,
when an event the size of the Camp Fire comes to your community, it is humbling. And I think you quickly find out how much you need everybody in your community, your faith-based, your nonprofits, government at all levels, even up to the federal level. And so in many ways, tragedies like this can bring your community together. and make them appreciative of each other, make the nonprofits understand some of the things that they can be involved in the preparedness side before things happen, and make us in government more aware of the help that all of those organizations can bring. So I have just been kind of thankful ever since it, to UC Davis, to Dr. Backer, to our faith-based organizations. I leaned heavily on our 2 tribal organizations to bring in volunteer physicians and nurses. We couldn't have done it without everybody, really couldn't, and I'm not sure we're doing it right now.
Well, the recovery still occurs and still happens. Any other questions? Yes, sir, over there.
I'm Jeff Williams. I'm from the Research Division at the Air Resources Board. I think this could be addressed by either Andy or Oscar, but I was wondering, you'd mentioned PM levels getting over 1,000 micrograms per cubic meter for several days, and what kind of guidance in either Sonoma County or in Butte County was provided to residents to go to, say, a cleaner air shelter? And if so, what criteria was used to determine those best places to go?
Well, if looking back, I don't like the answer as well as I hope the answer looking forward is. So we gave the advice, our first advice was to stay indoors if you could. Now, obviously, indoors means different things in different places, and some indoors is, that's a reasonable thing to do. In most cases, indoors is better than outdoors. It was interesting to us, and I think I went to an air quality event in the Sonoma area not too long ago, for me to realize how big a smoke event it was for Northern California, and that was the big question everybody else has been asking, is what advice did you give? In our world, that was about 10th on the list of priorities. In retrospect, I think we did a fairly good job of the advice we gave. But looking forward, we've worked with our schools and our university to say, when this happens again, we want you to be a safe airspace, and we're looking at all of those facilities to try to increase their filtration to at least MERV 13 and above. Especially the schools, because those kids, if the school closes because of air quality, as most people in the room know, those kids are out doing God knows what. I mean, they're either at home where we have uncertain air quality, or they're outside where we are pretty sure we don't want them to be. Of course, the messaging needs to be very clear about masks, that masks don't mean it's safe to be outside, and it doesn't mean it's safe to go jogging. But for those that can't avoid it, and that's the language we used, we had tens of thousands of people out in the field working. So for those people, we recommended masks. I'm not sure if I really answered your question, but you know, so I know that different jurisdictions, Sacramento County had different advice. From the beginning, our advice said, if you have any of these conditions, then a mask may not be beneficial to you. And of course, we have the challenge with kids always and masking. So we kind of took a generic approach to, if you have to be outside, you could wear a mask. If you don't have these conditions, doesn't work for kids. And we're trying to work on safe airspaces going forward. Matter of fact, my Butte County Office of Education Superintendent and I were both at a governor's disaster preparedness response yesterday, where we talked about PG&E power outages, and we talked a lot about safe airspaces. So.
Okay. I'm not seeing any more questions. Oh, one more. And maybe this is our last question before the lunch break.
If you saw the paper about 4 or 5 days ago, it was a dedication of a memorial for the first responders around Ground Zero. The folks became ill afterwards. I spent a lot of time there after that event and was at CDC and head of environmental health then. The bad news is we told those responders to wear proper equipment. They had that equipment. It was an emotional event where they refused to do it. They were actually fighting with each other a lot of the time because I think it was a way of dealing with their own stress. And I say that respectfully. It was telling people to do things doesn't work sometimes when you're dealing with such a mass psychological trauma. And I think as we think about communication, we've got to think about ways that people can really hear it, because we didn't do a good job on that one. David's got a thought on this one too, I'm sure.
And can you, well, just for the record, can you just identify yourself? Sir, can you just identify yourself?
Oh, I'm Dr. Richard Jackson. I'm on the planning committee.
Thank you. Was there any response to Dr. Jackson's remark? Thank you. All right, I think we can, we've reached the lunch break time, which is box lunches outside. And as was mentioned during the morning, we will be showing the entirety of the film that was produced by UC Davis back in this room if you like to watch it during your lunch break, or you're free to roam around. And of course, as was mentioned, I think there's some interesting teaching facilities just on the floor above us. But we're going to reconvene at 1 p.m. Thank you.